Pam Bondi and Kash Patel lied under oath. Todd Blanche also lied, but he wasn't under oath, so lucky for him. If you look at the Epstein Files release that's come out so far, there are multiple documents where there's evidence implicating Trump in not just crimes, but deeply serious crimes. And so I'll just give you one example. The FBI's own internal slideshow that they had is about 21 slides. Two of their allegations are about Donald Trump committing crimes. You also have a FBI document. It's an intake form of a witness who called the FBI's National Threat Operations Center. And the witness reports that he met a girl who directly told him that Trump and Epstein raped her. The Department of Justice never interviews this witness, doesn't do follow-up.
Now, you had posted about this online. And
what you just heard is not part of a social media post or an anonymous allegation. These are the words of a sitting congressman, Ted Lieu, and the point he is making is being described as based not on rumor, but on government records that have already appeared in multiple mainstream news reports connected to the Epstein Files. Ted Lieu is not drawing attention to what any court has decided. His focus is on what happened to information that already existed inside the federal system. According to news reporting, the Epstein Files include several documents that were part of internal government records at different points in time, including materials held by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Among those documents, two records in particular are described as raising serious questions. The first is an internal FBI slideshow that Lieu referenced, which reports describe as consisting of roughly 21 slides. According to coverage by Reuters and the Associated Press, some of those slides are reported to include references to Donald Trump in the context of criminal allegations. News outlets clearly note that the appearance of a name in an internal FBI document is not proof of a crime. But the question Lieu is raising, as reported, is what happened next. If allegations of that seriousness were recorded inside the FBI's own internal materials, then what investigative steps followed? And where is the record showing those steps? Reporting explains that FBI internal slideshows are typically used to compile raw information within the system. But that explanation does not answer why the investigative trail appears to stop there. According to news coverage, Lieu did not limit his remarks to the slideshow alone. He also pointed to another document linked to the FBI's National Threat Operations Center. CNN and NPR report that this document is a witness intake form which summarizes a call made to the FBI by an individual who said he met a woman who claimed that Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein sexually assaulted her. News outlets state clearly that this was a reported claim, not a court-established fact. But the purpose of an intake form is precisely to ensure that such information is officially entered into the system. The concern raised by Ted Lieu, according to reporting, is not that this allegation should have been accepted as true, but that after it was entered, there is no clear investigative follow-up visible in the public record. Reports note that there is no indication of a recorded interview with the witness and no publicly available documentation explaining how the allegation was evaluated or closed. At that point, the issue shifts away from proving or disproving allegations and toward how the system operates once information is logged. Mainstream reporting explains that law enforcement agencies routinely exercise discretion when handling leads, particularly when allegations are secondhand or lack corroboration, and that many tips do not advance beyond preliminary review. But journalists also emphasize that the Epstein case occupies a different category because earlier investigative and prosecutorial decisions were later criticized as incomplete or overly limited. Coverage by outlets such as the New York Times and Politico has repeatedly detailed how past plea agreements and narrow investigative scope created long-term distrust around the case. That background is central to why Lieu's questions are being treated seriously in the media. Reporting frames his remarks not as claims of intentional misconduct by investigators, but as a challenge to the absence of documentation explaining why certain leads appear to have gone no further. This is where attention turns to the Department of Justice, which oversees federal prosecutions and investigative priorities. According to Reuters and other outlets, the DOJ generally does not disclose internal deliberations or decisions related to specific intake records, citing investigative integrity and privacy concerns. that practice is standard, but reporting also notes that in high-profile cases involving allegations of significant public interest, silence itself can become a source of controversy. Lieu's question, as described in news coverage, sits exactly in that space. When serious allegations are entered into federal systems, what mechanism exists to explain how they were assessed, and why is that explanation not visible years later? Reporting on Trump's inclusion in Epstein-related records consistently adds context that Trump has denied wrongdoing and that no criminal charges have been filed against him in connection with these allegations. News organizations underline that being named in a government record does not equate to a legal finding. Still, the reporting makes clear that Lieu's concern is not about verdicts, but about consistency. If similar allegations involving other individuals had been logged within FBI systems, would the handling of those allegations have produced a clearer investigative trail? Journalists have also pointed out that the staggered release of Epstein-related materials can create the impression of new revelations, even when the underlying information had existed inside government systems for years. That delay between documentation and disclosure is part of why the files continue to provoke scrutiny. As news coverage explains, the Epstein Files do not resolve these questions. Instead, they expose gaps between what was recorded internally and what was later explained publicly. Ted Lieu's remarks, as reported, are directed at that gap. He is not asserting that evidence was hidden, but questioning why the system has never clearly shown how certain decisions were made. That unresolved silence, records without explanations, is what continues to drive attention back to the Epstein Files and keeps the discussion alive. After these questions, attention shifts to the full process through which federal agencies decide what to do and what not to do once an allegation is formally recorded. According to mainstream news reporting, when a tip, claim, or allegation is logged inside the systems of the Federal Bureau of Investigation or the Department of Justice, an internal review framework is triggered, regardless of whether the matter ultimately moves forward or is closed. Coverage by Reuters, the Associated Press, and the Washington Post explains that this review considers several practical factors, including how specific the allegation is, whether there is potential corroboration, which agency has jurisdiction, and whether the information can be independently verified. Reporting also notes that a large number of allegations do not advance beyond preliminary assessment, particularly when they are secondhand or supported by limited evidence. However, in the context of the Epstein Files, journalists have repeatedly emphasized that the issue is not discretion alone, but documentation of that discretion. In coverage of Ted Lieu's remarks, outlets have written that his core question is not whether every allegation should have resulted in prosecution, but why, when an allegation is serious enough to be entered into the federal system. The record of how that decision was made is not visible in the public domain. The history of the Epstein case intensifies this question. For years, the New York Times, Politico, and other outlets have reported that early Epstein-related cases involved limited investigations, narrow charging decisions, and plea agreements that later drew significant criticism and eroded institutional trust. Against that backdrop, when older Epstein-related records are released to the public, they are not viewed as mere historical paperwork, but as unresolved decision points that demand explanation. Reporting also explains that internal FBI materials, such as slideshows, intake summaries, or briefing notes, are often created to compile raw and unverified information so the agency can track what exists inside the system. But journalists have pointed out that when that same raw information becomes public years later, demands for transparency naturally increase, because the public wants to know how the agency categorized and evaluated that information at the time. This is the recurring gap highlighted in coverage of the Epstein Files. Records exist, but the reasoning behind decisions tied to those records is unclear. In references involving Donald Trump, mainstream outlets have consistently added the context that Trump has denied any wrongdoing related to Epstein and that no criminal charges have been filed against him based on these allegations. News organizations also stress that the appearance of a name in a government file is not equivalent to a court verdict. Even so, reporting makes clear that Ted Lieu's concern is not about guilt, but about consistency. If a similar allegation involving a different individual had been logged in the federal system, would the investigative handling have been just as limited, and would the decision trail be just as unclear? Coverage has also identified a pattern in how the DOJ responds to such scrutiny. According to Reuters, the DOJ generally does not comment publicly on internal deliberations or older intake records, and this is considered a standard practice aimed at protecting investigative integrity and privacy. But journalists also note that when a case is high profile and has already been associated with institutional failures, that silence can deepen public mistrust. This is why discussion around the Epstein Files repeatedly resurfaces. Each newly released document revives the same unresolved question: what did the system do at the time, and why? Reporting also notes that the staggered release of Epstein-related materials can create the impression of constant new revelations, even when the underlying information had existed inside government systems for years. This delay intensifies accountability demands because the public wants to understand why action or explanation did not come sooner. Ted Lieu's remarks have been viewed through this lens. He has not claimed that agencies intentionally concealed evidence, but he has questioned why agencies never clearly explained their decisions. Mainstream reporting shows that this unanswered space is what keeps the Epstein Files alive in public debate. The discussion does not remain focused on a single allegation or a single individual, but instead centers on the institutional process that logs allegations without fully clarifying their outcomes. When records exist and explanations remain incomplete, public scrutiny does not fade. That is why the Epstein Files continue to return to the news cycle, and why journalists have treated Ted Lieu's questions not as political rhetoric, but as accountability-driven inquiries. And if this breakdown helps you understand why the Epstein Files keep resurfacing and why investigative process matters, then if you liked our video, please support the channel by subscribing so we can continue bringing fact-based, record-driven analysis to you.